avid pacifist, and my father was preaching in a congregation during the Vietnam War, and consistently preached against American involvement in the war. And in fact, they worked for Norman Thomas every time he ran for president, which I think was 6 times. Norman Thomas was also a Presbyterian minister, and my parents enjoyed those kinds of activities, political activities. They were pretty conservative theologically, but very liberal and progressive in terms of social justice. And Norman Thomas was their kind of guy. And so I registered at 18 as a conscientious objector. And that was a long time ago, but it was largely because of my parents and also of Quaker influence. And attending high school with a bunch of Quakers was also a good experience for me. So I lived to tell the tale. When I interviewed a few weeks ago with the Personnel Committee, I was pleased to hear their stories about their own spiritual backgrounds. There were 3 birthright Quakers in the group, but most of them actually came from other traditions. And I found it to be marvelous. And when I asked them if they were representative of the composition of New Garden Friends, they assured me that you run the gamut from Baptists to Methodists to agnostics and even a few Buddhists who don't really buy into the idea of a personal deity. And that's really spiritual diversity. But just for fun, let's take a straw poll. I've already seen a couple of people who are ordained Presbyterians. I know at least one ordained Methodist in the room, Amy, right over here with Ava. And there are others. But just out of curiosity, how many Methodists are in the room? Raise your hands. Oh, quite a few. How many Presbyterians? Some. How many Unitarians? Not quite as many Unitarians. But Buddhists, a few Buddhists. Well, I think that's pretty good diversity. But how many of you are Quakers from birth? And quite a few. Well, there are a good number of you. It reminds me of a story that I heard one time about a couple of Jehovah's Witnesses who went door to door faithfully passing out copies of the Watchtower and the other magazine called Awake, and they converted to Unitarianism. Have you heard that story? But even after they converted, they continued to go door to door, but they just couldn't tell you why. This community, it's great to be here. It feels good. I know several of you already. I recognize colleagues from UNCG, where I worked for the last 10 years, and retired a year and a half ago to teach part-time in Guilford. The great thing about Guilford is that I can walk to work in about 10 minutes from my house, right on the other side. And some of my neighbors are here this morning. And this community reminds me of a very happy experience I had as an interim minister in a Methodist congregation in Argentina. It was historically Methodist. It was founded in 1837 in Buenos Aires. It was the first Protestant church in the southern cone of Latin America. The core group was made up of Welsh Methodists, but also some Anglo-Argentines who were also Methodists, and I was the first pastor in 150 years not to be a Methodist. But officially it was federated, that is, it was affiliated with a number of different denominations. The Nigerian ambassador, who was a Methodist, taught a Sunday school class, but we also had Lutherans from Sweden, Denmark, Germany. We had Dutch Reform from Holland and South Africa, and diplomats and business people from all over the world. And that was what I did in addition to working for the Methodist bishop, even though I was Presbyterian, as a human rights worker. I remember one Pentecost when we read the scripture lesson from the Acts of the Apostles in 14 languages. It was pretty amazing to hear those verses in Yoruba, Swahili, Arabic, Russian, Welsh, a number of languages. And it was amazing that such good energy existed amid all the cacophony of languages. So I like the diversity in this community. I was ordained 37 years ago as a teaching elder with the Presbyterians, and I felt called to be a teacher rather than a religious professional set aside to administer the sacraments. And I suppose that's the reason that I spent most of my life in ministries to higher education. I was a college chaplain, and typically it came with a half-time appointment as a chaplain, but also as a part-time professor, usually in the philosophy department or the history department. But that also included a decade as a human rights worker, as I mentioned, in Latin America, but we worked as educators. I taught at a seminary in Chile, where I served also as the chaplain. It was an ecumenical seminary that trained ministers for 8 different denominations. And I also worked as a conflict mediation specialist. When I retired from UNCG, I worked in a couple of different graduate programs. One of them was a graduate program in peace and conflict studies. In churches, I have primarily been working in short-term interim assignments. That's been my specialty, usually with a 1-year contract. Sometimes they last longer, but I've discovered that I'm good at it and I enjoy it, and so that's what I've done. But as a godchild of the Protestant Reformation, I take seriously this notion of the priesthood of all believers. And I have a deep respect for the Religious Society of Friends, who chose not to ordain religious professionals for the same reason that the Reformers rejected the ordination of priests as the sole mediators of divine will. Well, here we are at New Garden Friends meeting 3 weeks following David Bill's retirement after 43 years as your pastoral minister. And so this meeting enters a time of transition, and as you face many unknowns in trying to imagine your future as a Quaker community, I think we all know we cannot replace David Bills, nor can we find another one. He's one of a kind. So one of the challenges is to find out if New Garden Friends meeting has an identity that it can call its own, apart from David. And I think it's helpful for us to acknowledge the fact that his 43 years of pastoral leadership has had an enormous impact on the identity of this meeting. However, recognizing that, the strength of that witness, that impact, does not remove us from the responsibility of discovering and crafting a new identity as a meeting and establish an atmosphere that really is wide open to the future. Some of you are entering this transition period in full confidence that the meeting has a bright future, and there's every reason to believe that that will happen. And while New Garden Friends meeting will face challenges, we have a lot of very talented and dedicated people here who can work together with us to make sure that this is a good and productive period. In confidence, some people who are very positive and open about the future approach this interim period, this transition period, as a time for opportunity. Others, however, may have some anxiety about the future, and they may worry about making the budget or making sure that the meeting continues to grow spiritually. And a few people may even wake up in the night in a panic, certain that the meeting is in full-blown crisis. Regardless of the challenges that we face as a community, a time of transitional ministry will give us an opportunity to re-examine who we are, to assess our strengths and our weaknesses, and set clear goals. So facing the future and this uncertainty can also be a very rich time in the life of this congregation. And yes, there are risks, there will be pitfalls, but as we approach this interim period, I think it's really helpful if we see this as an opportunity to re-examine our commitments and share our best hopes and dreams. And if we do that, we can move forward toward a positive future. it may well turn out that we find a perfect solution to what some might consider to be a momentary crisis. Just a couple of weeks ago, I finished grading 2 sections of essays of Guilford College students, and I've never met a professor who liked grading papers, and I certainly didn't enjoy it with even graduate students. It just seemed to be so painful, and many of you here have had academic careers or teachers, and you know what it's like, but it's always a teaching moment, and I'm very, very slow at it. I'm slow reading, and I'm slow grading, but I try to make my comments responsible. And one of the things that I noticed between A students and C students is that the A students know the art of transition. In their arguments, well, they know how to craft an argument. They know how to move from sentence to sentence, from paragraph to paragraph. They know how to get from point A to point B and ultimately to point C, and C students barely have a clue of how to get there. And what I've learned in a couple of decades of grading papers is that knowing how to craft a transition, knowing how to use those tools of rhetoric is really a fine art. You know, many of us descended from ancient Celtic peoples. I'm a Scots Presbyterian, as I mentioned before, and we've only been Presbyterians since the Reformation. Before that, we were Catholics for a few hundred years, and before that, we were Celtic animists. But the ancient Celts paid attention to these in-between times, these transitions. They sensed both danger and opportunity in those delicate moments that are in between. That's why they worshipped at the transitions between night and day, at dawn and at dusk. And that's why they regarded the solstice and the equinox as high holy days, marking the change of the seasons and paying close attention to the transitions of our human experience. I just returned from this week, wonderful week, with my 4-month-old granddaughter, Alder, in Portland. I've been to Oregon 6 times, and every time I've been, it's rained every day. But this time it was sunny. It was a great week. Not only did I get to push my granddaughter in the stroller through the parks near my daughter's house, but we enjoyed abundant sunshine and rhododendron in full bloom. It was spectacular. And one night I drove down to Eugene, and I spent an evening with a writer friend and his wife. I've known him for a couple of decades. He's a retired psychiatrist and a Jungian analyst. And because of the 3-hour time difference, I got up very early the next morning, and I made my own cup of coffee and sat down at the kitchen table. And my friend Dave left a note for me on the kitchen table along with this little book. It was a facsimile edition of William Penn's Some Fruits of Solitude in Reflections and Maxims, first published in 1682. And the note said, "Hamilton, you need to read this book." And the irony is that we had not discussed the fact that this coming Sunday I would be auditioning at New Garden Friends meeting. But you need to read this book. And so early that morning over coffee, I read William Penn's little book, Fruits of Solitude. And I remembered Carl Jung's famous line, "There are no accidents." We all know that William Penn founded Pennsylvania as what he called a holy experiment. And like any other dreamer who envisions a better way of living, Penn's idea is remarkably similar to Abraham, who left his homeland to seek a better life. In Hebrews 11, the writer tells us that Abraham obeyed when he set out not knowing where he was going. By faith, he sojourned for a time in the land of promise, as in a foreign land, living in tents, as did Isaac and Jacob, who were heirs with him of the same promise. For he looked forward to the city that has foundations, whose builder and maker is God. Unlike Abraham, William Penn knew where he was going. He was going to Pennsylvania, and he could find it on the map. Although New Garden Friends know where we are, they know where we're going, where we might be headed, we may not know exactly how we're going to get there. we haven't completely worked out the details. And guided by his Quaker ideals, William Penn tried to work through the details of the community that he was founded, and he drafted articles of governance. But obviously, after all these centuries, Pennsylvania is no utopia, nor is New Garden Friends Meeting. And as we begin this period of change, this time of transition, we can still be instructed by William Penn's Holy Experiment. Regardless of how good things have been here in this meeting for the past 270 years since you were founded, like Abraham and like William Penn, it's natural and it's necessary to seek a better land. Given the number of utopias invented by philosophers and writers, especially during the Enlightenment, Thomas More wrote the humanist satire, Utopia, which we know means no place. It's almost as if we're hardwired to imagine that things could be better. There's no doubt that early Christian disciples under threat of persecution would look forward to the holy city, and they envisioned this apocalyptic ideal. They crafted a vision of the just society without pain, without sickness, without death. And centuries earlier, it wasn't unique to the Judeo-Christian tradition, but centuries early, Plato also envisioned the Republic. It was a utopian society governed by justice and reason, and it's a very captivating vision. But this dialogue of Plato, when Socrates is cornered by his detractors who demanded that he show it to them on the map, the philosopher admitted, okay, you've got me. I can't show you the Republic on the map, but if I'm governed by these ideals, I can try to build the Republic in my own life, and maybe I can influence others to join me in building the just society. So as we begin this in-between period in the history of New Garden Friends, it's important to examine these previous attempts to imagine and build a better community. Not only can we draw inspiration from visionary writers like Plato and John the Apostle, we can continue to be inspired by George Fox, by William Penn, and by David Bills. But as I mentioned earlier, there will be pitfalls, there will be setbacks. It's easy to make mistakes, and it's easy to misappropriate the vision. And that's why I think it's critical to be guided by the Quaker ideals that formed this community in the first place and shaped really who we are in our Christian experience. So when we begin the task of constructing a utopia right here and right now, like the New Jerusalem, or like William Penn's Holy Experiment in Pennsylvania, it's good to keep in mind the guiding ideals. The thing that distinguished William Penn's approach to what he was about to do to constructing this utopia, and he didn't really think it was a utopia. He wanted to craft a workable society. But the thing that really set it apart was that he knew that that community, that province, could not separate itself from the teachings of Christ, particularly the Sermon on the Mount, and the Quaker ideals that shaped him, the ideals of nonviolence, of mutual respect, of religious freedom. These were principles that he held dear and by which he lived his life. And the same holds true for other utopias. Not too long ago, I reread a book by Chogyam Trungpa, the Tibetan Buddhist who escaped Tibet in 1959 with the Dalai Lama. And Trungpa is head of another Tibetan lineage. But what he said was that we cannot construct the holy city, the Tibetan holy city of Shambhala, apart from the core tenets of Buddhism, the Four Noble Truths, the Eightfold Path, and that's the mitigating factor. We have to make sure that our efforts, our work together, that our efforts are grounded morally and that they're guided by the principles that we hold dear and that have shaped our lives. Well, even though Socrates admitted that he could not locate the Republic on the map, He couldn't necessarily take people there, but he hoped that he could construct it in his own life and maybe persuade others that together we can build this city. There's a story about the Canadian High Commissioner for Refugees who happened to be visiting Chogyam Trungpa in India. And he asked him, he said, you know, I've read about this very captivating vision of Shambhala, the Tibetan holy city. And I want to ask you, is this just a metaphor or does it really exist? And if it exists, can you show me where it is on a map of Tibet? And Chogyam Trungpa paused for a minute and he said, yes, it does exist. I cannot locate it precisely on the map, but I caught a glimpse of it in deep meditation while looking in the mirror.